Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
I'm Justin Tewald. This podcast is brought to you by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. I just want to say, we're so pleased to have a sponsor to help us defray some of the costs of production. And it reminds me of something that it's kind of funny, actually, Richard, to think about it. As you and I both know so well, because we're talking about it constantly and we have new logistical problems to face every single day, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And it just occurred to me recently, we haven't told our listeners about any of it. So maybe it's worth our while to discuss what those things are. I guess the place to begin is just to say there is a fair amount of stuff being announced on the blog that hosts discussions of our podcast series, which is called Warp, Weft, and Way. And we have a link to it in the show notes for the podcast. So you can go there and you can ask us questions. You can post questions or comments. And occasionally we'll have these events where we'll ask our listeners to suggest things for us or to make proposals. So very recently we had this sort of request that we sent out. Actually, it was at the request of a listener that we did this, where we invited people to suggest passages that we could discuss. And so quite a few people either wrote us emails or nominated passages on the blog or elsewhere. And so now we have a big list of potential topics that we're going to discuss in the months ahead. That's already come and gone, but we have some other things in the works. For example, we do plan to do a live recording in conjunction with the meeting of the American Philosophical Association, the Pacific Division. That one meets in San Francisco next, and that meets in 2025. So stay tuned for that. By the way, that's usually around April 16th to 19th. So that's on one of those late afternoons or evenings. We're going to do a live show. You'll see more about that on the blog, I think. It might be that sometime, maybe this year or in a future year, we'll taping a live recording in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong, my home institution, but that's not yet settled. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. It seems like there's even more going on kind of in the works behind the scenes than that, Richard. But I feel like those are the things that we're confident enough about that we can announce. Maybe I should sort of restrain myself and not mention the other things. Is there anything more to add? I guess I just want to make clear to people that there are other ways of participating in the show if you want to. And I bet a lot, because we're so bad at reminding people of it, I suspect there are a lot of listeners who don't even know that.
Yeah, no, that's right. So we have been getting emails from various listeners with suggestions, and also people like Brad Kokolet, who's a philosopher, terrific philosopher at University of Kansas, gave us some really good suggestions. And we really enjoy getting suggestions for future episodes since I think it's really nice to have some listener contribution, audience contribution. And also a lot of the suggestions are really, really good. So we really do appreciate that. And I think going on Warp, Weft, and Way, this really good blog on Chinese philosophy, it would be a great thing because there's some really interesting conversations about various topics in Chinese philosophy and also some of our previous episodes as well. We'd love to hear from you about that. Yeah, I'm also very excited about this possible live show that we're planning to do in April at the Pacific APA in San Francisco. So I don't know, maybe some of even our non-philosophy people or listeners might think about joining. Like it'd be really cool to have as part of
Yes.
the audience certain listeners who are not necessarily professional philosophers or academics even. In fact, yeah, we've gotten some emails from people who are not
Yeah.
academics, and we love actually getting these notes from them. It's quite gratifying, maybe even more so in some
Yeah.
ways. Yeah, some of the future plans, and hopefully we'd get to meet some more of our listeners. It'd be really cool. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can't quite bring myself to talk about the specific numbers, but it's safe to say that we're still very small potatoes program compared to like all the podcasts that people know about. Nevertheless, we're both blown away. We're just sort of amazed that we have as many listeners as we do, as many kind of loyal listeners as defined by the number of downloads within, a month of publishing a new episode. We're kind of amazed. It's intimidating actually for me to think about the number of people listening to these words as I speak them. It makes me more likely to stumble, I'm sure, which is, I think, an insight into wu-wei, non-action, which is our topic for the day. We have this plan to discuss what in Chinese is called wu-wei, often translated as non-action, sometimes translated as effortless action in English. And it's a really key central concept in Taoism in particular, but as it turns out, it's an important concept in a number of early Chinese philosophical schools of thought or traditions. in addition to the fact that we're discussing wu-wei, this is also our first episode on the Daodejing officially, or sometimes called the Laozi. Laozi being the legendary author of the Daodejing. So it's inaugural in both of those respects. Yeah, Richard, you offered to give listeners a preview of wu-wei itself.
Yeah, just very briefly, because in part two, we'll be discussing these passages of the Tao Te Ching at much greater length, but just Wu Wei as a concept. So the first Chinese character here, Wu, is often translated as not in English, like a negation term, but it might be better to translate as something like without. And then
Yes.
Wei is something like purposeful or deliberate action. And so literally, it's something like, it's an action without specific purpose or deliberation, something like that. Again, it has this rich history. Now, that little description, as our listeners will come to realize, is insufficient because there's actually just much more greater depth and richness, issues about morality, goodness, normativity, about broader context of metaphysics, as we'll explore in just a little bit. But the concept, there is this long history in Confucianism and Taoism. And although we're going to be focusing on the Tao Te Ching, or what's also sometimes called Lao Tzu, as Justin pointed out, which I think is maybe the most translated work. I've heard this. I wasn't ever entirely sure if that's quite right. I mean, the Analects has been translated a lot too, but maybe what sometimes people mean is there's been more different translations of the Tao Te Ching than any other classical Chinese text. Is that right, Justin?
Surely it's right that it's the most translated classical Chinese text. I think that's just got to be right. I've even met people who don't read classical Chinese and yet have done translations, say, just because they feel like they have, I don't know, they're attuned to the Tao or something, and they feel the vibes. And so they feel like they understand the sentiment that the author is trying to express. For example, I was at a conference, I met a computer programmer who did a special kind of variant translation just for other computer programmers because he thought it spoke to computer programmers in a way that there was a sense in which the intuitions that the author is tapping into are intuitions that and kind of the instincts are ones that would serve computer programmers well. Yeah, it's just people sort of help themselves to translating the text. I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many.
And that does reveal just how beloved the text is. I guess people really connect with it, and they feel this kind of a personal connection to a lot of the ideas, which are really intriguing. Now, the Tao Te Ching is literally the classic of the way and virtue. That's sort of the literal translation. Or a classic of the way and power, depending on how you translate "de." But sometimes the text is also called the Lao Tzu, and I think it used to be called the Lao Tzu more often, as I understand it, in the past. Possibly because the text used to be attributed to the figure of Lao Tzu, or literally old master. But there's controversy about the existence and nature of this person. I think, as I recall, P.J. Ivanhoe thinks that there was no such specific figure. But I know some scholars do think that there might be like some individual that is being referred to, although we don't really know that much about that person. So there's a lot of, I guess, things we don't know about exactly foundational figure for this text. But we do know that it was composed over time, and there have been more than one person who helped to edit it and compose it in the form we have it certainly today. And of course, the Tao Te Ching alongside the Zhuangzi, which we have discussed a number of times, a listener favorite, is considered the two central classical Taoist texts. Although our recent guest Tao Jiang would say that the Tao Te Ching maybe doesn't belong in the same category as the Zhuangzi, which is very interesting. But usually when we teach this stuff, I think we tend to talk about it as these two texts as part of the classical Taoist tradition. And the Tao Te Ching is made up of 81 chapters, which is composed of roughly around 5,000 Chinese characters. And there's been some recent excavations. I don't want to go too geeky into it, but it is really interesting that they dug up these old bamboo slips, like, for example, in 1993 in Hubei province, which contained a version of the Tao Te Ching dating back to like 300 BCE. So that really is very cool. And I think there's also now a fair bit of work, actually, right, done by, I think, like Scott Cook has a book. Who's over at in Singapore, an excellent sinologist and scholar. I haven't explored that stuff in detail, but it really is really cool and fascinating, the archaeological discoveries. Yeah, that's, I think, at least basic outline of the concept and a little bit of the history, of course, although there's way more here to say. Do you have anything more to say about this, Justin?
Yeah, actually, I was sort of smiling as you mentioned the doubts about this legendary author, Lao Tzu. I don't want to be the kind of person who takes people's dreams away and their love of a text. But yeah, I think it's not even very controversial anymore that the Lao Tzu, what we call the Lao Tzu now or the Daodejing now, was probably composed over time by multiple authors. If there was an actual person who was called Lao Tzu in history, there's no particular reason. I'm not sure that's even true, by the way. You don't see mention of him until sort of a later period. But even if it's true, there's no particular reason to connect that person to the Tao Te Ching. On the other hand, I don't want to discourage people from reading it as a unified text. I mean, it basically, as a historical force in the sort of intellectual history and history of religions in China, the Tao Te Ching behaves as though it's a single authored text. Many, many people have worked very hard to read the various chapters and even subunits of those chapters as a unified, speaking with a kind of one voice. And as a result, they've come up with some very fascinating worldviews. So I don't want to discourage people from reading it that way. Yes, that's what we're going to be discussing after the break. And so we'll dive in shortly. Okay, the topic that we're going to focus on today is wu-wei. We'll tentatively translate it as non-action in the context of the Tao Te Ching. Richard has kindly chosen 3 passages from the Tao Te Ching that are both traditionally used as kind of sources, primary classical sources for the concept. And those are chapters 2, 37, and 48. We'll read them aloud as we often do. We'll also put them on Warp, Weft, and Way, the blog where we host discussions for the podcast. Let me start before we actually read the passages and discuss them in detail by just giving a little bit more of the kind of historical background for this concept, for this idea of wu-wei. So one thing that some people are a little bit surprised to learn is that it was not the exclusive property of Taoist philosophers. You see this phrase wu-wei in other important classical sources, certainly in the Analects and in the Han-Feizi, which is a major legalist text. So it's not just Taoists that talk about wu-wei. However, most people seem to agree that it's somehow more central in Taoism, which is to say, first of all, that like they just spend more time thinking about it, talking about it, trying to develop intellectual, almost spiritual exercises meant to help you sort of experience it or have some sense of what it is. And there's also to say that it's somehow a central feature of their kind of theory of how you should live, what it means to live in accordance with the way, to have to follow a way that they consider to be a good one or a valuable one. So it just figures much more prominently in Taoism than other schools of thought. Now I'm going to kind of introduce to you this idea, which I suspect will be a little bit controversial, which is that I think actually wu-wei is a polysemous term. That is, it's a term that means, there are different senses. It has multiple meanings. And so I think we can kind of break it down roughly into those 3 meanings. I'm going to say there are at least 3 meanings of wu-wei. And one of them is political. The other 2 are personal. So we can sort of break it down that way. There's the political sense and there's the personal sense. And the political one, actually, I think we're going to discuss it a lot because the passages that we're looking at today are often interpreted as talking about wu-wei in the political sense. So let me set that aside for now and talk about the personal sense. So one understanding of wu-wei in the personal sense that a lot of people kind of come to Taoism already knowing about has to do with what are now sometimes called by cognitive scientists and psychologists flow-like experiences. So flow-like experiences, that's actually not a term from Taoism. It's from, I think the term was coined by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, this positive psychologist who wrote this book called Flow in the 80s. But the idea is there are these experiences where you're sort of performing at a peak level, but it feels almost effortless. A great deal of the hard work of performing the skill or undertaking the activity is done by sort of fast and frugal implicit cognition, the kind of automatic cognition that you are engaged in when you're doing something really skillfully, like playing an instrument or engaged in a sport. So people think of the skill stories like the one that we discussed with Karen Lai not long ago, the butcher or cook Ding story, or the woodcarver Ching story, or what have you, where someone is just, kind of at peak level and yet not really self-conscious about it, not really working hard, not kind of thinking through each of the steps, that just kind of moves smoothly, effortlessly, automatically. That's at least meant to give you a sense of what a full life experience is like. There's so much more we could say about them. And that's one understanding of non-action that I think probably that comes primarily from the Zhuangzi. There's another Taoist text called the Liezi, which also tells skill stories that seem to be describing full life experiences as well. So that's one of the personal senses. I'm going to say flow-like experience, for lack of a better way of putting it, sense of wu-wei. But there's another sense which I think figures more prominently in the Daodejing and in so-called other primitivist chapters of other Taoist texts, where it's not so much an emphasis on people doing skillful things at a high level. The emphasis instead on people just following their instincts, their natural instincts, which is something quite different, right? Like just trusting themselves to interact with other human beings in an instinctual way, to, I don't know, jump, leap, perform some task in a natural way, pulling back their hands from a hot coal or what have you. Maybe that's even arguably a kind of non-action. Anyway, the point of many of the Taoist accounts of Wu Wei, I take it, especially in the Tao Te Ching, seems to be that people are acting in a non-purposeful way where they don't necessarily have some sort of intervention from on high. So they don't have someone ordering them. They don't have a kind of strong, highly structured moral worldview or moral concepts that they're applying, that they're striving to, in some sense, instantiate or emulate in their activity. That's a different sense of Wu Wei that I think figures much more prominently in the Tao Te Ching. So my controversial claim is essentially that there are kind of multiple senses of Wu Wei, and it's not entirely clear how they're linked up. There's these two personal senses. One has to do with skill stories and full life experiences. This other one has more to do with natural instinct. And those two personal senses, maybe I have this crazy theory that they're linked by a kind of common phenomenology, which is to say, they're linked by the sense that in terms of what it feels like internally to be in a state of Wu Wei or in a process of Wu Wei, it feels the same subjectively, even if, in fact, in terms of describing its sort of their objective features, they're two different things. That's something maybe we should discuss on another podcast episode when we're explicitly comparing Zhuangzi with the Tao Te Ching. But all these personal senses of Wu Wei are yet something else from the political sense. Oftentimes, when you see Wu Wei discussed in the context of politics, it's really, I don't know, stop me if you disagree with this, Richard, but it's tempting to just read it as something like non-intervention. Wu Wei as an approach to governance, as something that we recommend to like dukes, kings, or other sorts of government, is just the kind of governance where you let things be, where you trust that people are naturally going to organize themselves into relatively harmonious, coherent communities. You don't need to intervene in a heavy-handed way. So non-intervention might be a good sort of synonym for Wu Wei in the political sense. The idea is you sort of fall back on something else other than sort of regular micromanagement type governance or coercive interventions where you're punishing people all the time. So yeah, that's my attempt to sort of give you a feel for the range of meanings that this term wu wei can be invoking.
Mhm. The French term laissez-faire, I've
Yeah.
heard that sometimes it's attributed to the Tao Te Ching, and I was never entirely sure if that's just an apocryphal story or what
Yeah.
exactly is the history there. Do you know anything about that, Justin?
I've never heard that.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised. So there was this tendency in, kind of the era of Leibniz. So Leibniz, this European philosopher who's very interesting, would read translations of Chinese texts, especially the Confucian ones. But anyway, there was a period early in European history when a lot of people in Europe were reading Chinese texts. They were inclined to read into Chinese texts many of the ideals, maybe sort of romantic or Enlightenment ideals that they sort of wished for Europe. So I wouldn't be surprised if some big admirers of laissez-faire government were also reading Taoist texts. I hadn't heard it before, but offhand, it
Hmm.
doesn't seem crazy to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought maybe the story I had heard was that Adam Smith somehow, I mean, I don't think he read any classical Chinese text, but yeah, somehow he had picked up
Hmm.
the term from another French scholar. But sorry,
Mhm.
maybe I should have brought this up. I should have done a little more homework on it. But I had heard that and had always wondered whether there is some truth to it or not. Because, right, laissez-faire, like within economic systems, has to do with kind of this non-interventionist, free market kind of idea. And of course, there's also that image of like, I mean, this actually does appear in the Tao Te Ching. I forgot which chapter, but where a good ruler should only, or how is it put? Like, you shouldn't overcook the fish, right? Or you should
Yeah,
only flip the cooked fish once
small
because
fish.
it a small fish, yeah. Because if you keep flipping it, you're going to burn it, or
Yes.
you're going to do a worse job. And that's supposed to be a way of thinking about good rulership. So it has to do with not being too heavy-handed.
Yes, I think that's chapter 60 on of the received version of the Daodejing. Yeah, ordering a large state is like cooking a small fish, roughly. Yeah, it's a kind of famous line. Yeah. And it's a very helpful, it's one of the rare moments in the Daodejing where they give us a kind of concrete image that I find quite
Hmm.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know you're a vegetarian, Justin, but supposedly when you cook steak, you're also only supposed to flip it once,
Oh, really?
because yeah, that's kind of a rule. I remember learning. I think during Korean barbecue, they also say that. But anyways, yeah, that non-interventionist, non-coercive, the prizing of kind of non-interventionist attitude does seem like a common core theme throughout the Tao Te Ching. And there
Yeah.
is quite a bit of wisdom there too, I think. This idea that like being unforced, is generally often a good methodology, not to keep
Yeah.
interrupting, not to, be too heavy-handed and to try to manipulate things according to your desires, because often that can be counterproductive. I've always found that to be a very wise insight within the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, and
Um,
I should say it's you shouldn't be surprised that the people who like non-action in the political sense also tend to like non-action in the personal sense.
mhm,
Because if you think about it, one of the reasons you might be inclined to endorse non-action in the political sense, which is to say more laissez-faire government or not, sort of not so interventionist government, is because you trust that people's instincts are going to serve them pretty well. So
mhm.
that kind of personal sense I mentioned, that's more about instinct and less about super refined skills. If you think that's a good thing too, then you might think, well, people are better off not having heavy-handed moral concepts applied to their behavior, not having governments intervene and tell them you should do this rather than that. Just let small rural communities more or less govern themselves in the way that small communities where people know each other very well often do,
Mhm.
through the power of social relationships and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you could kind of see it working better within a smaller community or a smaller social unit. But once you
Yeah,
have like a larger nation state where things become a lot more complicated, and yeah, there is some understanding that we do need to satisfy the needs of, let's say, the lower class or of the poor. It does become more tricky.
yeah,
But that idea that oftentimes people are really interested in their own welfare, and maybe they're better served if they're able to carry out their own desired ends. I think that's, we find that in John Stuart Mill, of course, and that's kind of a basis of a
yeah,
certain kind of liberal worldview. I also was intrigued by this way that you broke up the personal. So one has to do with sort of flow-like activities, and the other has to do with natural instinct. I did have a quick question about natural instinct. I mean, but
hmm
of course, like we can develop like a kind of second nature, right? As philosophers talk about it, we can
yes,
cultivate
yes,
certain habits and dispositions that almost seem something like natural instinct, except we've developed them and they've become part of our kind of a second nature that's very easy to carry out. So, is that even a relevant distinction here? Are we talking about both, or did you have both in mind?
yeah. So I should start by saying my view is controversial. So for much of history of Chinese thought, Chinese religions, people have tended to read both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi as Taoist texts as belonging to the same school of thought. And so therefore, I mean, maybe obviously this isn't just always going to be true, but being members of the same school of thought, they assume that they're using terms in roughly the same way. So they thought Zhuangzi's wu-wei was more or less the same as Lao Tzu's wu-wei. My view is to say that there are chapters in the Zhuangzi that I tend to think of as kind of more primitivist chapters that really do echo the Tao Te Ching's account of non-action, or seem to value non-action in the same way that the Daodejing does. But there are also chapters, including the famous ones, that report skill stories and give these sort of poetic accounts of them, where it's really something else. And your distinction between first and second nature is very helpful here. So I think everyone has some experience with second nature. They've learned to, play piano or an instrument probably in elementary school. They had some pieces that they played, they had down pat, they learned by heart. And so for them, playing those pieces is second nature. I myself, like I haven't played piano for a long time, but probably if I sat at a piano, there are still some songs I could, once I've hit the first few keys, I could just immediately find myself.
Riding a bike is probably kind of a second nature.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I'm sure you know how to ride a bike, but you had to learn it. It wasn't like you're not born
Yeah.
with it. But of course, now it's just like instinctual and it's really easy.
Yes. Yes. And I don't know how helpful this is, but I guess the distinction that I have in mind has to do with how much artificial work goes into acquiring this second nature. So this is just Justin talking off the top of his head, but my sense is that like the Tao Te Ching essentially is endorsing a way of life that it comes from a kind of, it's more or less consistent with how people lived before there was a lot of formal education available. So kind of some called primitive, I think it was P.J. Ivanhoe who coined the phrase primitive agrarian utopia to describe the ideal. If you look at chapter 80 of the Tao Te Ching, which describes sort of simple village life and a great deal of peace between villages, that seems to be a kind of series of primitive agrarian utopias. And of course, in these primitive agrarian utopias, people are still learning things. So it's, in a sense, the stuff that they do when they're engaging in non-action or, non-purposeful action, effortless action, is still acquired knowledge. I mean, they're farming, they're plowing, they're planting seeds and so on. You have to learn how to do those things, but it's somehow closer to nature. There's not as much artificial work that goes into acquiring them. Whereas learning how to carve bell stands, learning how to carve up an ox, learning how to fish or ferry people across a river, maybe that's closer to nature than things like, I don't know, doing a mathematical proof or something, but
Hmm.
it still seems to me like it's much more artificial. So the distance between one's acquired nature or second nature in the case of the Zhuangzi style, skill story style accounts of non-action seems to be much greater than it is for the sort of non-action that you see in primitive agrarian utopias of the kind you find in the Tao Te Ching. Yeah.
So we do find a kind of an optimistic view of human nature, though, here, that the
Yeah.
natural instincts do tend toward our own good or flourishing,
Yes.
which some
Yeah.
people might reject, saying that, well, actually, no, I mean, there's all kinds of disordered or bad inclinations human beings can have, like egocentric, selfish impulses or violent
Yeah.
impulses, which, yeah, I have always wondered about that, what the early Taoists would have said about that, because that seems like a pretty common part of the human experience as well, seeing these more negative kinds of tendencies.
Right. Yeah, maybe we'll have a chance to get into it. I mean, the Taoists, they certainly want to distinguish between good and bad natural instincts. So, for example, one could argue if you look at a primitive agrarian utopia, you can imagine a community actually that works relatively well without a lot of heavy-handed moralizing or intervention. So you could imagine, people just generally know each other well. So of course they have compassion. And if one family or one person hits upon hard times, maybe their crops die because of a plague, a pestilence or something, and the others help them out. That all seems like you could say that seems natural. Yes, that does seem like something that would be characteristic of people who are living close to nature, who don't have a lot of training and education would do. But so also do things like, I don't know, bullying, the tendency for like the strongest or toughest person in a community to kind of pick on others. That's arguably
Mhm.
natural too. Or
Mhm.
fighting, maybe even engaging in kind of low scale warfare. I think modern warfare really is a very artificial business, but
Mhm.
like just the kind of the big fights that break out between people or
Or just coveting, just jealousy, just wanting
yes,
what
yes.
someone else has. That
Yeah.
seems like a very common, pretty hardcore inclination that we do see, um,
Yeah.
even in our own selves sometimes. And so it seems, yeah, I've wondered if, I mean, are those unnatural? I mean, or are those bad natural tendencies that, yeah, maybe the early Taoists would have had a way of saying we're not something that ought to be satisfied or given way to.
Yeah, the primitivist Taoists are going to have to, well, one way they can try to deal with worries like that is by telling a different story or giving us an account of how that kind of bad behavior. I mean, it's pretty clear they consider that problematic behavior. The Daodejing does not recommend war. It's
Right.
it's a pretty
Right.
pacifist text.
Yeah.
So,
Or acquisitiveness, right? Like
or
wanting to
yeah,
gain power and fame. I mean, they're
absolutely.
definitely against
Yeah.
that.
So they're going to have to tell a story according to which those are not really in tune with our natural instincts, those covetousness and what have you. Yeah, we should have an episode someday on chapter 80, the one that describes the primitive agrarian utopia in a
Hmm.
state before people could even read and write. And maybe that will give us a chance to sort of assess those sorts of claims about how people are when they're
Yes,
closer to the
absolutely.
state of nature.
Intriguing chapter. And you find a kind of also, in some sense, like kind of anti-culture, kind of a,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you can kind of juxtapose it with the Confucian emphasis on their prizing of culture and education, which
Yeah.
might come up anyways as we read through these other chapters. Okay, well, I guess maybe we should turn to some of the passages that we plan to discuss now. And we're going to
Yeah.
begin with chapter 2. And it's a pretty important chapter, I think, and we'll find a lot of these core themes that we just touched on. So I'm going to read this chapter for our listeners now. Chapter 2 of
Okay.
the Daodejing. Everyone in the world knows that when the beautiful strives to be beautiful, it is repulsive. Everyone knows that when the good strives to be good, it is no good. And so, to have and to lack generate each other. Difficult and easy give form to each other. Long and short offset each other. High and low incline into each other. Note and rhythm harmonize with each other. Before and after follow each other. This is why sages abide in the business of non action and
Mhm.
practice the teaching that is without words. They work with the myriad creatures and turn none away. They produce without possessing. They act with no expectation of reward. When their work is done, they do not linger. And by not lingering, merit never deserts them.
Yeah, this is a really interesting passage. I find that when I teach classical Chinese philosophy, we often come back to this passage. We often discuss those opening lines in particular. Everyone in the world knows that when the beautiful strives to be beautiful, it is repulsive.
Hmm.
Everyone knows that when the good strives to be good, it is no good.
Hmm.
Uh, and
Yeah, we should
that
unpack that a little bit. Yeah. What do you think about those two lines? I mean, everyone knows, right? So I guess we must know.
yeah, yeah, right, yeah. It's kind of funny, yeah, that it's phrased that way. Actually, there are other ways of translating those opening lines, and terms are sort of abstract enough that you could read it a number of different ways. But let's just go with this translation for now. If we read it this way, everyone in the world knows that when the beautiful strives to be beautiful, it is repulsive. Everyone knows that when the good strives to be good, it is no good. I feel like it's a phenomenon that we're familiar with, even if we don't use those exact words. So beautiful, striving to be beautiful, maybe a more apt or useful analogy in modern life would be coolness, like at least these days, everyone knows that someone who strives to be cool thereby fails to be cool. Like the whole idea of being cool is that it just
Mm,
comes effortlessly
right.
for you. Like if you're really striving somehow to like live up to an image, then that's just not cool.
You're a phony,
You're
right?
phony. Yeah, exactly. It's contrasted with phoniness. So similar seems to be true of goodness, that like when you strive to be good, it's no good. That's what the passage seems to be suggesting. Now, I've given a kind of psychological account. I've said that basically that sort of inherent in the sort of psychological definition or one of the necessary psychological features of beauty and goodness and coolness for that matter is that you're not self-consciously striving to instantiate that very thing, whether it's beauty, goodness, or coolness. There are probably other ways I know that there are other ways of reading it, but that sort of works best for me because I tend to read the Tao Te Ching as being very astute about the subtle psychological features of some of these phenomena. So just in terms of like understanding how the passage breaks into different parts. So everyone knows that when the beautiful strives to be beautiful is repulsive. Everyone knows that you shouldn't strive to be good if you actually want to be good. That is usually taken to be a kind of description of the non-purposeful part of non-action. The whole idea, what does it mean to say that non-action is non-purposeful or doesn't have sort of deliberative aims? It means that like you're not trying to live up to some description of the good thing that you in fact are living up to, ironically enough, right? You're not striving to be good. You're not striving to be cool. But then it goes into this next section that you read, Richard. To have and to lack generate each other, difficult and easy give form to each other, long and short offset each other, so on and so forth, right? So this is a kind of listing of opposites and how these opposites depend on one another, and maybe also how these opposites can be blended with one another. But this list of opposites, it seems to me like it's orthogonal. It's not entirely clear how relevant it is to non-action. So
Mhm.
if you look at commentaries, as I tend to do, you see the commentators working very hard to explain why it is that the author suddenly moves into this discussion of opposites. But just to give listeners a sense of how this is usually understood, and some of you kind of already know this, the whole idea is that the opposites depend on each other in the sense that there's a way in which you can't really specify, define, or fix what they mean without having a sense of what it's contrasted with the contrast case. So long and short offset each other, right? Is this particular, I'm going to hold up an envelope here. Is this a long envelope? Well, there are shorter envelopes, so it just so happens that we live in a world where there are sort of two standard size of envelopes, and this one is longer than the other standard size. But we could live in a world where this is in fact a very short one, and most envelopes are, a meter long. And so in order to specify whether something is long or short, you have to know what it's being contrasted with. That's one way of understanding the point that this particular subsection or section is trying to make. So then after listing the opposites and sort of noting how they depend on each other and perhaps blend into each other, we conclude with this next section, which very clearly is a description of non-action. It says, this is why sages abide in the business of non-action, and that really is a translation of wu-wei, and practice the teaching that is without words. They work with the myriad creatures and turn none away. They produce without possessing. This is all taken to be description of non-action. They act with no expectation of reward. Another way of translating that line, they act with no expectation of reward, is they act without preconceptions, without depending on anything, any sort of prior expectation or conception of who knows what, conception of value maybe or something. And then when their work is done, they do not linger. And by not lingering, merit never deserts them. I find that description of non-action very helpful, even though it's obviously cast at a very abstract level too.
Yeah. So this puzzle, it is kind of interesting. We begin with these two lines, and then it says, and so, and then you're like, oh, okay. So what follows? Well,
Yeah.
the fact that these opposites require each other, I guess the way I had read this was something like the following, which is because the world is bound together in this tight way with the opposites requiring the other. So like the way we tend to divide up the world is in terms of like clear divisions between good and evil, like suffering and pleasure or suffering and joy. And we obviously naturally tend to appreciate one over the other in all kinds of ways. And the beautiful over the ugly, let's say. But the Tao Te Ching, I think like one idea you find throughout the text is a kind of embracing the whole. Like you should kind of
Mhm.
find a perspective where, yes, perhaps naturally we tend to shun something and like something else, and we have aversions and we have desires and likes. But a way to, I suppose it's saying, live a really meaningful, flourishing life is to recognize how all the good and the bad, as we call them, are kind of necessary in some sense. And so it's because we strive so hard to avoid what we term to be bad and go after what we term to be good that often leads to this kind of messiness, chaos, and injury. And so
Yeah.
it seems to be offering this suggestion at some level that you gotta like accept it all. Now, I don't know if if that's
Yeah.
really possible, or if I don't even know if I can quite accept that idea, but there's something there. I think there is some wisdom there that being able to let go, being able to accept things is a really crucial part of gaining some wisdom and insight. So
Yeah, that's
broadly speaking, that was kind of a few thoughts I had.
Yeah, that's interesting and very helpful, Richard. The list of opposites and their kind of codependency, their mutual dependency, that's on your reading, not so much a justification for non-action, but like a way of motivating it. All right. To
Hmm.
remind you that whatever it is that you may be striving for, it requires in some sense its opposite. And that has a way of undermining the belief that it really matters whether you succeed. So long and short, high and low, difficult and easy, having and lacking, these are all kind of, they stand in for various things that you might think that you should desire or not desire, right? You should either desire or be averse to. Just
Hmm.
like people strive to reach high points and not low points, to have
Hmm.
longer things and not short things, and so on. But they all depend on each other. So from some sort of perspective, it doesn't actually matter whether you achieve the good thing. You should embrace the whole. And then once you're in that state of mind where you don't think it matters, then you're more likely to be able to achieve non-action. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that. And the last part is these lines like they act with no expectation of reward, like the sage who's
Yeah.
engaging in non-action. They don't have this like deep, rigidly fixed desire to achieve some specific end. Now, of course, there is a puzzle here. Like, why do they do anything then? And why is
Yeah.
what they do
Yeah.
even good or worthwhile? But I suppose when you have this kind of background assumption that, but the natural instincts will tend toward the good, it's when culture and socialization and education kind of messes up our natural instincts that we end up kind of deteriorating or developing bad, harmful desires. If you do buy into that assumption, background assumption, then what happens with the sage is that they're going to naturally go towards what's good and they're not going to have this goal driven orientation. So they're not expecting things. They're just acting
Yeah.
instinctually and naturally. And that's why they also don't linger. They're not like waiting
Yes.
around, right? Like someone who's like waiting to be praised, like kind of like my kids, like sometimes they do nice things here and there. Like
Yeah.
they clean the room and they're like waiting for me to
Yeah.
praise them. They're like, "Hey, daddy, look, I cleaned the room." And
If
they're
they
kind
don't get some
of
acknowledgement, then what's the point, right? Like,
right, what's the point? Right. So they're kind of lingering for something. And of course, I don't mean to make fun of them too much. I mean, I think we're all kind of like this to some
yes,
extent. But
we are.
yeah, you want a little bit of praise. But the true sage, of course, does not, because yeah, I guess it doesn't matter. And that's not even like really a part of the natural unfolding of a
Yeah.
of a good human life.
Yeah, I like that, Richard. Like maybe one way of characterizing it is to say that maybe this is not fair, but let's say that one could, in a wu-wei manner, like through non-action, clean their room. And just because it's like sort of what they're inclined naturally to think they should do. It just looks too cluttered to them and they want some visual tidiness or something. I'm not sure that's right, but let's just run with it as an example. And let's say they do it in a wu-wei manner rather than the way you suggested your kids do. One way of putting it is to say that they have a goal, but at no point do they see their action as motivated by outcomes. Like it's not for the sake of getting some product or outcome that they do it. So that's why they don't linger, as the text says. Like once they've done it, they're like, oh, wow, isn't that awesome? They dwell on how cool it is now that they've achieved the goal. So they have a goal, but they have it in a sort of emotionally speaking or cognitively speaking light way. They're not deeply invested in actually getting the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's one way of characterizing it. I'm not sure. Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the best kinds of activities are those activities where it's not necessarily like an end or an outcome we're seeking, right? Like when you're listening to music, you're not
Yeah.
listening to it so that somehow you get this thing. You're just listening to it because music is pleasurable and it's enjoyable, just like spending time with friends. It's not like, oh, why are you spending time with friends? So that you can get what, more money? I mean, well, that would be really bad. Those are just the most important things of human life. And there's no further end for those sorts of activities. And maybe it's focusing on that kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe I'm not being fair to the people who do think of hanging out with friends or listening to music as having some further end. But one way you could make the point really clear is by saying, like, what is the end state in terms of at the end of the event that you hope to get from all these things, right? Like, by the time
Mhm.
you're done listening to music or by the time you're done hanging out with your friends, there's no product that's there, right? It
Right.
clearly suggests that it's whatever it is that a value that you're seeking, it's in the process
Hmm.
itself and not necessarily in the product that remains after the process is over.
Hmm. Right. Right.
Yeah, so That's chapter 2, very famous chapter in the Daodejing because among, lots of reasons why it's famous, but I can't help but speculate that it's also because it's one of the chapters that just about everyone who's read the Daodejing has read because they got at least as far as chapter 2, right? So it's always the opening chapters that tend to
Mhm.
be really famous. Not always, but it's often the opening chapters that tend to be famous. So there's another one that you selected, which I also find very interesting, chapter 37, which is usually understood as is very much about non-action. And I was going to read that one. It's pretty short, so I'll just read it quickly. The way does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. Okay, so that's the opening phrase. That's a really quotable phrase. It often appears it's quoted by later philosophers and scholars all the time. It's a wu-wei or wu-wei in classical Chinese. It even appears in at least one other passage in the Daodejing, maybe even more than one. So I'll just read it again. The way does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. Okay, so that does nothing is essentially wu-wei. The way is non-active. It's another way of translating that. Okay, I'll continue reading. Should barons and kings be able to preserve it, the myriad creatures will transform themselves. After they are transformed, should some still desire to act, I shall press them down with the weight of nameless unhewn wood. Nameless unhewn wood is but freedom from desire. Without desire and still, the world will settle itself. Yeah, I basically see this, and I'm not alone in this. A lot of commentators think that this is essentially addressed to people in the ruling class. So rulers themselves, maybe their ministers or advisors. And it's recommending wu-wei as a kind of model of governance. So now we're talking about the sort of laissez-faire, non-interventionist political wu-wei, where you don't have to necessarily do a lot of actual governing in order for your state or your communities to be well governed. So it goes on to say, barons and kings, if they're able to preserve it, the myriad creatures will transform themselves. So the idea is you can let the myriad creatures, which doesn't just refer to human beings, by the way, but animals and insects and so on, maybe even plants, surely plants, they all, if they just sort of follow their nature, they transform themselves in a way that's relatively harmonious and conducive to the sort of life that you want to bring for your people. And then it says, after they are transformed, should some still desire to act, right? So should there be some people who still have desires, essentially, to go out and engage in deliberative action, I shall press them down with the weight of nameless unhewn wood. Okay. Unhewn wood is another very powerful metaphor, almost sort of a trope in Taoist texts. So it refers to sort of raw wood that hasn't yet been carved up. And it's supposed to be a very evocative metaphor. So the idea is it's the kind of wood not being carved up that's probably analogous to not being reshaped by culture, by civilization, by norms and expectations that come from like heavy-handed cultural institutions and that sort of thing. And nameless unhewn wood is but freedom from desire, it says. So remember, the problem that the text is trying to address here is cases where you, as a ruler, are engaging in non-action, political non-action. That is, you're just letting the myriad creatures transform themselves. You're not intervening. And there's still a few people who have desires to act. So they're not necessarily practicing personal wu-wei themselves because they have these desires. And so presumably those desires are problematic. They interfere with wu-wei. And so what do you do about those people in those cases? The text says, I shall press them down with the weight of nameless unhewn wood. That's mysterious to me. I think there's many ways we can run with this idea of pressing down those more covetous people with nameless unhewn wood. But it goes on to say, nameless unhewn wood is but freedom from desire. Without desire and still, the world will settle itself. Freedom from desire, by the way, it's a good translation. It just flows very well. I like it. It's elegant. But it's actually a translation of wu yu, same wu that is in wu wei, to be without or there to be an absence of. And then yu is desire. So it really just means nameless unhewn wood is to be without desire. So yeah, that's the passage.
Yeah, I believe this might have been Edward Slingerland, but he juxtaposes this really intriguing passage with the Analects 1.15. There's that famous line about the way that the self needs to be sort of cultivated like a piece of jade, And then the famous
Ah,
line is something like, as if cut, as if polished, as if
yeah.
carved, as if ground, suggesting that Confucius really thought actually the way of cultivation, which should be a primary goal for Confucians, is through this long, difficult process of carving and polishing through culture, socialization, education. And here we have this very different model, which is that actually all that kind of carving up, all that kind of work often just produces desires and I guess bad desires that are impeding us from realizing a happier life or a better society. Yeah, I find that to be really intriguing that those are two such different models.
Yeah, it suggests that in the kind of discourse of the time, the very scholarly discourse that the Daodejing and Confucian texts are participating in, carving in general is like a well-known evocative way of referring to the sort of reshaping that culture is meant to do, especially formal education. And yeah, so if you look at Analects 115, where a student quotes from the Shijing, the Book of Odes, about carving and polishing jade, basically as an analogy to describe the process of moral cultivation. And Confucius approves of that quote. He thinks that's a very astute way of characterizing cultivation. That suggests that, yeah, the Confucians really are, in a way, polar opposites to the Taoists in terms of how much carving they think is necessary in order to live the way of life, the good life as they understand it, the life that accords with the way that they're recommending to people.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the Taoists are right insofar as they are focusing on the various bad cultural desires that we form, like the desire for maybe fame and power that tends to be heightened within a certain social structure and
Yeah.
intensified, and that leads to your demise. And some of those artificial desires, maybe we can call them, are implanted in us, and they are something that actually is counterproductive for our own good. But I wonder if the Confucians, I mean, yeah, they might just say, well, yeah, no, we were talking about the necessity of learning norms and socializing because we are communal creatures and we need to live together. And just the basic desires that you find in children, not wanting to share. I mean, that's not going to work. So you
Yeah.
do have to go through this long, arduous process of reorienting some of those desires, rechanneling them, revising them, and editing them. So
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder if we can just ultimately just combine both ideas.
Yeah, I actually think, right. So if you want to read the Tao Te Ching charitably as kind of developing one relatively consistent philosophical worldview, or even kind of a ethical worldview, then you have to reconcile the fact that there are these passages which seem to make these radical claims about having no desires, such as this one. This one actually uses that phrase, no desires, being without desires, with other passages that suggest some desires are okay and other ones are not.
Hmm.
So there's
Hmm.
one passage that says, it starts out by saying, the five colors, I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but we can always
Hmm.
put it in the show notes. The five colors will make
Right.
us blind, the five sounds will deafen us. And then it goes on to say, so the sage is for the belly and not for the eye. And so what it seems to be suggesting is that when we go about our business in the world, we encounter these beautiful, attractive things, and they actually elicit new desires, sort of artificial desires for things. So
Hmm.
the five colors stand in for, beautiful artwork and pretty things that once we see them, we want them. We didn't
Hmm.
have a desire for pretty things before we encountered pretty things. Contrast that with hunger, with desires of the belly, in sort of the metaphorical terms of this passage. Hunger you will have whether or not you encounter food, right? I mean, of course, you can acquire specific tastes for specific kinds of foods, but even if you don't, if you never encounter, a particular kind of bowl of soup or something, if you're wandering around the world and very hungry and you smell some soup, you'll want it. So it's not acquired in that sense. It's not artificial. So one charitable way of reading the Tao Te Ching when it recommends against having desires, or when it suggests that someone who develops a kind of desire has a desire to act and therefore is no longer living in a wu-wei manner, in a sort of a non-active manner, is to say that, well, it's referring to a subset of desires, the artificial ones. And that's helpful, I find, because sometimes when discussing this with students, I can tell some students see it as this whole idea of being without desires is very implausible right from the
Hmm.
start.
Right. So the basic desires are okay. The fundamental desires.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, like you listen to Beethoven or Miles Davis. I mean, I mean, there's so much culture and like
Yes.
so much development that was required to get to that level. And yeah, I mean, those are beautiful sounds. And I guess if I never heard them, I couldn't desire them. But
Yeah.
now that I have, my world has been opened up. And would they criticize even that? I don't know. That's a little tough. I don't know if I can accept that.
Yeah. I struggle with this. I think, right. It seems like the Tao Te Ching sort of recommends to people what we earlier called the primitive agrarian utopian life, which is to say the life of people who aren't even literate yet, which is interesting because the text. So when you see depictions of the primitive agrarian utopia in the Tao Te Ching, chapter 80, or in the so-called primitivist chapters of the Zhuangzi, it seems like, yeah, the people who live these lives are blissfully ignorant precisely because they don't have any formal education, you know? And so one of the dangers of having lots of education is that you begin to imagine all the ways in which the grass could be greener, you know? Like you start to think about better ways of living, more efficient, cost-effective ways, how you might have more leisure, how you might have more fun if you had some other lifestyle. And people are better off not acquiring those desires. That seems to be a relatively consistent and clear message in the Tao Te Ching. But you can't help but wonder when you're reading it, well, given that you're recommending basically that people live in this kind of pre-educated state, who are you talking to, right? Because these are literate people who can read the Tao Te Ching. And so who is your readership? You know, who is this kind of audience that's reading the text? So this is where one can only speculate that maybe there's sort of like two intended beneficiaries of the Tao Te Ching. They're the direct beneficiaries, who are the people who are actually reading the text. And maybe as some of the early commentators and as some of the scholars who work on the Tao Te Ching speculate, it really was meant primarily for members of the ruling class as advice on how to rule and how to govern people. And so those people, of course, they include us, right? They include you and me, Richard, and they probably include every single person who's listening to this podcast. We're already spoiled. We've already had access to good music and heard it and developed desires for it to hear it again. We already can read and write, and so we have access to all these sources of information. And so the best we can do is sort of begin gradually to unlearn, I don't know, the most pernicious values and attachments, sort of
Hmm.
unwind the most pernicious attachments that we've developed,
Hmm.
somehow overcome those more problematic acquired desires. But as for, I think in the Tao Te Ching, it's still holding out the hope that like an enlightened ruler will see the advantage of keeping their people in a state of, in terms of formal education, ignorance. And those people will have it even better than we do because they won't even be tempted in the ways that those of us who have an education will be tempted.
Yeah, actually, that I think leads to our last passage because,
Yeah.
in a way, it does suggest that, well, you could take it incrementally. So there is a kind of a day by day, you might aim a little bit for a little bit more simplicity, I suppose. Maybe would be
Yeah.
one way. So,
Chapter
okay, so
48.
yep,
Yes, that's,
chapter 48, and that's the third and last passage we'll, I guess, talk about for this episode. And I guess I should read this. It's a pretty short passage, chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching. In the pursuit of learning, one does more each day. In the pursuit of the way, one does less each day. One does less and less until one does nothing. One does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. Gaining
there
the
it is again.
world always is accomplished by following no activity. As soon as one actively tries, one will fall short of gaining the world.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there, Richard. I was reacting spontaneously, so perhaps in ways that the Tao Te Ching would recommend, to the fact that you had just read once again that quotable line, one does nothing, yet nothing is left undone. Wu-wei are wu-wei. There again, we see this idea that somehow when you engage in non-action, that leaves nothing undone. It's very tidy in that sense. You know, when you engage in non-action, you don't have unfinished business.
Mhm.
But I like the way you introduced this, Richard. Yeah, 48 is a way of addressing the very problem that we mentioned, which is that among the potential beneficiaries of the Tao Te Ching, they're the people who are fortunate enough not to have any formal education. And if they get an enlightened ruler, that enlightened ruler will keep them in that state of ignorance so they don't spend a lot of time dreaming of a better world and they'll be able to live close to nature. But as for those of us who are already spoiled, what can we do? The opening lines seem to be speaking to us, right? In the pursuit of learning, one does more each day. Okay. In the pursuit of the way, one does less each day. One does less and less until one does nothing. So it seems to be suggesting that we shouldn't pursue learning, shouldn't pursue formal study education, the acquisition of cultural values and norms and all those things. And we should gradually subtract. We should do less and less until, I guess, probably the habits that we've acquired from our learning are no longer interfering with our natural dispositions. And then we'll be in a state where we can do nothing. We can engage in wu-wei, and yet nothing is left undone. Yeah, then it goes on to say, gaining the world always is accomplished by following no activity. So you're better off not trying to engage in activity. And in some sense, that may be poetic or maybe literal, you've gained the world. As soon as one actively tries, one will fall short of gaining the world. It does seem like it's pretty clearly talking about wu-wei, and it's addressing itself to people who have to work their way back to that primitive state like us.
Yeah. A more general level, I mean, it is critiquing, I think, in some ways, the way that we tend to live our lives, which is just filled with busyness and,
Yeah.
activity that just is unending. And we tend to, it just creates so much anxiety and stress. We're just kind of in this kind of on this chase. It just
Yeah.
never seems to quite end. And is this one damn thing after another? And there is this actually one of the things I enjoy doing. I don't know if you've ever done this, but on YouTube, there are these clips. Some people, they'll interview the elderly, people who are like 90, and they'll ask them, yeah, what advice would you offer to someone who's like in their 20s or 30s? Or if you were to be able to go back, what advice would you give to your younger self? Of course, the advice varies. But there is a kind of common theme often I find, which is, I would say, or they would say to relax more or to not be so caught up in the rat race and the pursuit of, ends. And because, life does go by and it is finite. And if you cannot find a way of appreciating the moment, the day that you're actually living, you'll just keep running through those days and just always with your eye toward another object, another goal. I say all this because I feel like I'm maybe too goal driven myself. And I think a lot of us are. But there's a kind of fundamental critique here and a kind of nudge toward reflection that I think is quite important. There's something really important that this passage is saying.
Yeah. So actually, as I get older, I'm more inclined to say that exactly that thing to younger people. And that you should not let yourself be so preoccupied with your goals that you don't sort of appreciate the moments that you're in or the advantages you have. I sometimes worry that there's a way in which we're artificially projecting our confidence that things are going to work out back into our younger selves. So I think it's like easy to forget that when you're, say, in high school, or college, your future is so uncertain and it could go in so many different directions. And it seems to you probably that like anything is possible if you fail the next class or if you like have a, catastrophic encounter with someone that's really important to you, then it will just send you down a different road entirely and your whole life trajectory will be wrong. Now, in retrospect, as you get older, you realize, no, in fact, it worked out pretty well for a lot of people. As they get older, they feel that way. So in a way, like they can't even imagine their younger selves worrying so much about the future. It just doesn't seem like rational or just like a reasonable way of thinking about the future. But in fact, maybe it is kind of a reasonable way of thinking about the future when you're in that state and where so many possible roads are open to you. So I worry a little bit that that's unfair. On the other hand, I have to say, just speaking from personal experience, there's no question that there's such a thing as being so deeply enmeshed in the busyness of the next task and kind of worries and anxieties about the next task that you basically can go through an entire day without experiencing the day in a way.
Yeah, you're waiting for another day. But then, but the day you're living you're living it. You're in the actual moment. And it does seem important if you can to find a little bit of peace in the day that you're actually having. Even though, I mean, there are things that you need to do and tasks that we have responsibilities, but If you can integrate that with this recognition of, or the achievement of some kind of tranquility about the actual life that you have right now, that would be certainly good.
Yeah, and the text does use that term quite often, tranquility, jing in
Mhm.
Chinese. Yeah. So we've seen this line twice now. One does nothing, and yet nothing is left undone. Wu-wei or wu-wei. So one engages in non-action, and yet it leaves nothing undone, nothing that's
Mhm.
sort of unfinished, leaves no unfinished business. And I just want to say, like, the way that we've been talking about this idea in the context of the Daodejing is that we have these writers of the text who have a kind of serene confidence in nature and people's natural behaviors to take care of themselves. So I worry that the way that we've suggested that we read this text, this line, one does nothing, nothing left undone, is just that like it's true if you stipulate or if you accept that people's natural behaviors tend to work themselves out. So if you're a ruler, for example, and you're practicing wu-wei as a form of governance, you don't actually fuss about all the little policies and rules, and you don't make rules saying that people have to be nice to their parents or they shouldn't bully each other and that kind of thing. Because that kind of intervention is only going to make things worse. It's going to create more tasks, more busyness, more stuff for you to enforce, right? And just let people's natural behaviors, the kind of small community relationships that people have in these rural agrarian utopias, let them work it out. And that will leave you with fewer things to do. That's one way of understanding the line, one does nothing, yet nothing is left undone, right? But that way of understanding it suggests that it's something about how the natural world works that makes the statement true. One does nothing and nothing is left undone. There's another way of reading that line, according to which it's not because the natural world works in a certain way, but it's because of your own psychology, your own point of view as the person who's engaging in non-action, that the statement is true. So on this more psychological reading, the whole idea is that like things that are undone are things that you feel you should do, right? Sort of by definition, what it means for an unfinished task to be that stands in need of finishing. So
Mhm.
like I'm sitting at my dining room table right now. I guess one of my unfinished tasks could be like sweeping under the dining room table. Like I
Mhm.
often sweep around the apartment, but I don't often sweep under the table. That
Mhm.
means that sweeping under the table is an unfinished task. It's an undone
Mhm.
task.
Mhm.
But it could be that like if I didn't
Mhm.
think of it as a thing to do, then it would no longer be an undone task, an unfinished task. And so in that way, it's sort of like it's almost true by definition that if you engage in wu-wei, depending on your definition of wu-wei, then you'll have lots of unfinished tasks.
Because you let go of those tasks. They're no longer tasks that need to be done. Right, like papers, right, that you're aiming to
Yeah.
write. Does it really matter if I write this paper or not? And then you conclude, no. Well, good. I don't,
Yeah.
yeah, this is not a paper that needs to be written. So I
Oh my
have no
gosh.
paper that I need to write. That's kind of a little bit
Oh,
dangerous, but
you're speaking to me, Richard. I'm deep, deep in a paper right now, and it seems like it could go on for 60 pages or more. And I need to start adopting that particular attitude toward it. Yeah.
hmm It definitely there's a kind of I mean, perfectionist streak here,
Yes.
like anti-optimization. I mean, yeah, it is interesting. Like, I mean, you can find anything on YouTube now, but on YouTube there are all these like kind of nutritionists and fitness gurus now. Yeah, they talk about optimizing sleep, optimizing your nutrition and
Oh,
exercise, and
yeah.
you should drink 2 glasses of water and then got to get a little bit of sunlight and then you should avoid carbs during this stretch of time and there's all these exercise regimens and I actually watch them because I want to keep fit and healthy, but I do also worry sometimes too that I don't know, this optimizing kind of mentality is kind of dangerous, and of course there's only so much you can do also, and maybe at the end of the day you need to balance the thing, like
Yeah.
also.
I mean, I try very hard to. The Tao Te Ching was my first point of entry into Chinese philosophy. I read it in high school. I've always loved the text, although at some point I kind of decided that I'm basically not a proponent. I do think that that what's sometimes called non-action in what I think of as the more Zhuangzian sense, the kind of acquired nature sense, is a really fantastic thing. And that's because it allows you to kind of have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. So the goal, if like when it comes to optimizing sleep or exercise that you just mentioned, Richard, those are good things like sleeping well and exercising. Not if you're stressing about it and if you're kind of micromanaging your life or kind of spending much of your day doing logistics, when am I going to get this next run in or what have you? That's not good. Then you're fretting and stressed all the time and it's, distracting you and it's keeping you from enjoying the moment. But it is a good thing, in fact, to exercise regularly and to sleep soundly and to eat well and that kind of thing. If those things can become second nature for you so that you actually just want to spontaneously, as it were,
Hmm.
go out and exercise at that time of day when you normally do, that I think is the ideal. So I'm not so much a proponent these days of living close to nature in the Daodejing sense of living close to nature. But I certainly do think that wu-wei recommends a kind of agency or way of navigating the world, or sort of gives us a vision of a kind of agency or way of navigating the world that is very attractive.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think well, those are the three passages that we plan to discuss, and I think we've covered them. And yeah,
Yeah,
Justin, did you have any last parting thoughts about this last passage or
yeah.
any part of the conversation today?
It's just the beginning of so much more that we can say about non-action, and I hope that we'll have more episodes about it. But I feel like we should exercise restraint. We should not see those future discussions as undone tasks. We shouldn't get too attached. Maybe we'll get to them, maybe we won't. So in that spirit, maybe I can say, I hope that you will spontaneously, of your own volition, without any particular deliberation, listen to our next episode, but not see that as some task that's unfinished or undone as well. And we look
Mhm.
forward to hearing from you then. So we'll have to say that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.